We're following multiple developments in the story. CNN was first to report that top officials over at the White House asked the FBI to refute stories that Trump associates were in frequent contact with Russian officials during the election campaign. The White House says there was no wrongdoing and that it was not trying to pressure the FBI. Also today, President Trump lashed out at both the FBI and the news media. Let's bring in our experts. And let me start with David Axelrod. David, he's blaming the FBI for these leaks, for the ongoing investigation. But in the process, he seems to be confirming CNN's own excellent reporting.
He sure seems to be, Wolf. First of all, let me say I agree with what Congressman Hyams just said, which is it's hard to understand how a story about the White House Chief of Staff calling the FBI to try and enlist them in quelling a story that discomfited the president is a national security matter or a classified matter. So we should set that aside. That's no more true than when news organizations do some stories that he doesn't like, that qualifies them as enemies of the people. But the underlying story is one that should be further explored by the Congress and others, and that is, did the Chief of Staff call over there for that purpose? Because there are real lines of demarcation that should not be crossed by a White House Chief of Staff running political errands for the president over at the FBI. And if that's what happened, it clearly bears more investigation. You think it was irresponsible, Mark Preston, to be coordinating, if you will, a White House Chief of Staff asking the FBI for some backup in denying these stories?
Yeah, and I would even go a little bit stronger than saying coordinating. I would say influencing, attempting to influence the FBI to try to get on board with the narrative that there was really nothing there and they needed their backup, especially at a time right now when there's so much politicization around the FBI with this past election and the ongoing investigation. So while I don't think necessarily Reince Priebus was trying to do it out of, let's put it this way, I think he did it and he didn't realize what he was doing.
It was just inexperience, is that what you're saying?
Correct, yes.
Sondland, walk us through what happened at the White House, a truly extraordinary development. They were having a press briefing off camera. It's what they call a gaggle, and accredited White House correspondents almost always are invited to these gaggles. They're alerted. This is what's happening, usually in the press secretary's office. I spent 7 years as a White House correspondent during the Clinton administration, so I'm very familiar with this. But all of a sudden, certain news organizations, reporters, were barred from going in.
That's right, and gaggles aren't an abnormal thing for a White House to do. They typically hold an off-camera gaggle so they don't step on the president's message of the day when he gives a big speech, as was today when President Trump spoke at CPAC. But when they called this gaggle, reporters gathered outside. Time for the briefing. CNN, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Politico, and BuzzFeed were turned away. They said they were not on this list of invited attendees. And other outlets, I should point out, that were invited and were allowed into the briefing today were Washington Times, Breitbart News, more conservative outlets, which certainly leads to the question of, are these outlets being let into these gaggles because of their coverage, whether it was more favorable or less favorable. Of course, this is what you have many White House correspondents, veteran White House correspondents, saying is unprecedented, and the White House Correspondents Association today protesting the decision, saying it's wrong to unfairly, leave out people from their daily.
Yeah, her own Sarah Murray, our White House correspondent, she was standing outside the press secretary's office, ready to go in with her notebook, and all of a sudden she's told, "You're not on the list." What explanation are they giving?
Well, they're saying that that they had it as a pool, and for our viewers out there, that is a group of reporters who will report on behalf of all the White House correspondents. It's usually done because of spacing issues. They had it as a pool, and then they decided to expand it. They didn't go beyond that, but here's the problem with that. Timing is everything. Just a few hours earlier, you had President Donald Trump before a big audience at a conservative gathering calling the media the enemy of the press. And I'd like to say one thing that John McCain said recently during a Meet the Press interview. He said that by doing this, this is how dictators get started. And I think that is something, I think a lot of people look at us in the media and say, oh, you cry a lot about not getting access or that you're being attacked. It's not about us. It's really about, this is a slippery slope going down.
Let me play for all of you what Sean Spicer said back in December, he's now the press secretary, what he said about the possibility of barring news organizations at that time. Listen to this.
And I think we have a respect for the press when it comes to the government, that is something that you can't ban an entity from. Conservative, liberal, or otherwise. I think that's what makes a democracy versus a dictatorship.
David Axelrod, you remember the first 4 years of the Obama administration. You served in the White House. What they're saying, Trump officials now, is that the Obama folks did the same thing to Fox News that we're doing right now. And you're shaking your head. We looked it up. You did at one point say, and I'm quoting you now, Fox is not really news. But go ahead.
Well, yes, and there were times when I was troubled by some of the reporting they did, the stories that suggest, for example, that Obama was educated in a madrasas in overseas, a story that, by the way, CNN quickly knocked down. Those things did trouble me. But here's what I didn't do, Wolf. When I was working for the White House, I never refused to appear. I was on their Fox News Sunday show on a regular basis. I never suggested that they be banned from gaggles or banned from the White House newsroom. As irritating as I found their reporting at times, I understood that was beyond the pale. And what we've seen in the last 48 hours, expressed by Mr. Bannon, expressed by the president, is something we haven't seen before. This notion that if you write things we don't like, we're simply going to ban you. And here's the mistake they're making. This is not going to shut reporting down. Reporters are going to continue to do their work. They may try and put obstacles in their way, but I don't think that's going to change the nature of the mission of the press, the mission of the media, and it's only going to create more interest and more intense support for the role of the media in the future.
I did some checking, David. During the Obama administration, you never blocked Fox from coming to a briefing, but there were moments when there were round-robin interviews. There was one with Ken Feinberg, for example. All the major television networks got that interview. Fox didn't. The other TV networks complained. Eventually, Fox, I think, got that interview. You remember that incident?
Yeah, I do remember that. I also remember hearing complaints from various other news organizations that they went so long without having a Sunday interview and so on. News organizations complain. Those things happen. But what never happened during the Obama administration was this notion that news organizations were going to be completely cut out of coverage. What never happened was the President of the United States suggesting that any news organization was an enemy of the people because he was displeased with their coverage. This may be raised as cover by this administration, but it is a wholly different situation. You have a President of the United States and his Boswell declaring war on the news media, and I think that it'll be interesting to see what the public reaction to that is.
There's more to discuss on this. Everyone stand by. We got to take another quick break. We'll be right back. So listen to what the president said at the CPAC conference earlier today.
They say that we can't criticize their dishonest coverage because of the First Amendment. You know, they always bring up the First Amendment. And I love the First Amendment. Nobody loves it better than me. Nobody.
That clip right there is generating a lot of buzz.
It certainly is, because it sounds like President Trump is mocking the First Amendment here, and it struck a lot of people in the moment. But I think it took on some extra meaning after the antics of the White House today, this afternoon, from barring certain reporters from their off-camera gaggle. I was also struck in coupling that, and this is a point that Mark made a few minutes ago, coupling that with the things we heard from his top strategist, Steve Bannon, yesterday at the same forum, CPAC, where Bannon labeled once again the media the opposition. You had Trump today calling the media the enemy. Those two certainly sending every signal in the book here that they are ready for a fight, that they're going to continue this antagonistic relationship with the press.
You know, what was encouraging, David, was that once other news organizations who weren't barred heard that CNN, the New York Times, the LA Times, and other major news organizations were barred, they decided to boycott, to walk out themselves. Other news organizations like the Wall Street Journal, they stayed in there because they didn't know, and now they say they regret participating in that briefing, that so-called gaggle. Your reaction to that?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm an old reporter, Wolf. I spent 10 years as a reporter. I remember as a City Hall bureau chief once being threatened with expulsion from City Hall because the mayor didn't like stories that I had written, and there was a groundswell of support from my newspaper and other news organizations, and that didn't stand. I think that journalists have to hang together here, and you know the old saying, we're either going to hang together or hang separately. They need to stand up for the right of every news organization to do their jobs, and if it becomes the price of admission to write things that please the President of the United States, that's a price too high to pay. So they need to continue to press this issue with the White House.
Do you think he was mocking the First Amendment?
Well, I mean, we only have to listen to his own words to know really where he's at. He talks about when he's in press conferences, he'll point people out and say, oh, he's a good guy. He writes good things about me. Oh, don't talk to that person over there. That person's a bad person. I think that he's mocking the whole system if the system doesn't work for him.
It's one thing to block news organizations from getting credentials during a campaign. It's a private operation. But it's another thing to block news organizations when you're working for the U.S. government.
Right. So if we've seen this with the Democratic Party since 2004 onwards, where Fox News was blocked out by the Democratic Party when it came to presidential debates. But to your point, that's a campaign. That is a political decision on your part. What we're seeing in this White House right now is a taxpayer-owned building with taxpayer-owned employees who are making decisions on a free press. And that itself is a very scary thing.
Well, during this campaign, the Trump campaign occasionally blocked news organizations, including the Washington Post, for example. They didn't like the reporting. All right, everybody stand by. Investigators are now revealing how the brother of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un died. The question, how did his killers obtain an internationally banned chemical weapon?
You can't predict the market.